Hello and welcome to IAMC Radio and Podcast. Today on Understanding Our History, we're exploring some thought-provoking ideas from Dele Farotimi and his book, Do Not Die in Their War. It's a collection of essays, actually posed in 2019, that really kind of digs into the heart of the Nigerian political landscape.
Yeah, Farotimi doesn't shy away from tough topics at all. Tackles corruption, the dynamics between citizens and the state. He even takes a hard look at the role of the middle class.
And one of the things that I found really interesting was how he connects these issues, showing that they're not just these isolated problems, but that they all kind of feed into each other, creating this cycle that's really holding Nigeria back.
Yeah.
So one of the first things we're going to unpack is his take on the justice system. And he says it's not just flawed, it's completely inverted.
What's really fascinating here is that Farotimi argues that justice in Nigeria is more of a luxury, than a right, especially for those without power or wealth. And he believes that those in power who are often the most corrupt are the ones judging those pushed into crime by circumstance.
It's so interesting. He uses the example of Mr. Onigan, who was potentially facing corruption charges, to illustrate this point.
Right, and Farotimi argues that regardless of Onigan's guilt or innocence, he shouldn't have been removed from his position based solely on unproven allegations. He should have faced due process.
So is he saying that the courts are being manipulated by those in power, that they aren't truly accessible to everyone?
Yeah, that's his argument. He highlights the irony that courts should exist for all, yet the powerful seem exempt.
Right.
This raises a crucial question. If the institutions meant to uphold justice are compromised, what hope is there for true fairness?
It's definitely unsettling. And, this lack of accountability within the justice system actually connects directly to his next point, which I thought was so powerful, the idea of the abusive husband state. I mean, what an analogy.
It's striking, isn't it?
Yeah.
He uses this comparison to illustrate how Nigerians view their government. You expect so little that even small gestures like inconsistent electricity are met with gratitude.
It's as if people have become conditioned to accept this dysfunctional relationship as the norm. But how did this dynamic develop? Is it a recent phenomenon?
That's a great question. This mentality has deep roots in Nigeria's history. Decades of broken promises, failed leadership, and a lack of basic services have eroded trust in the government. This, in turn, allows figures like James Ibori, a former governor convicted of money laundering, to thrive. Their corruption is almost expected.
Right. It's like being in a relationship where you've been let down so many times, you just lower your expectations to the point where you're just grateful for anything remotely positive.
Right.
But Farotimi seems to suggest that simply fighting corruption isn't enough, that there's something deeper at play here.
Yes. He argues that corruption is a symptom of a much larger issue, impunity. It's not just that people are corrupt, it's that they face no consequences for their actions.
And this is where Farotimi gets really personal, sharing his own journey from blaming specific leaders to recognizing corruption as a systemic issue that's ingrained in the culture.
He realized that, to some degree, everyone is complicit. From petty bribery to looking the other way, when those in power abuse their positions, there's a collective acceptance of these behaviors.
This makes me wonder, how does this idea of impunity play out in our own lives beyond just government corruption? How often do we see people get away with things because of their connections, wealth, or status?
That's a crucial point to consider. Impunity isn't just a problem for politicians, it's something we encounter in our everyday lives. Challenging it requires a shift in mindset. We need to hold ourselves and others accountable regardless of their position.
So if corruption is a symptom, what's the root cause, according to Farotimi?
He points to a few key factors. One is the lack of a strong independent judiciary that can hold those in power accountable. Another is the erosion of ethical values and a culture of greed that has permeated society.
But what about the role of the people? Does Farotimi believe that Nigerians are simply victims of this system, or do they have agency to change it?
That's where his argument about the Nigerian middle class comes in. He essentially asks, are they failing in their duty to demand better?
So he's suggesting that the middle class has a specific responsibility.
He contends that instead of being a force for positive change, many in the middle class have opted out of the system. They've created their own parallel structures mirroring the state's failures in areas like education and healthcare.
He gives some pretty stark examples to illustrate this point. He talks about the explosion of private schools, which reflects the decline of the public education system, and how the middle class seeks health care abroad while the poor are left with inadequate facilities.
Right. He's not saying that seeking better options is inherently wrong.
Yeah.
But he argues that it creates a dangerous dynamic where those with resources disengage from the public sphere, further weakening the systems that need reform.
It's almost as if they've given up on the idea of a functioning state and decided to fend for themselves. But is that really a sustainable solution? What happens to those who don't have the resources to opt out?
That's a critical question. And it's something we'll explore further when we discuss Farotimi's call for individual action and what he believes is the duty of leadership.
But before we get to that, I'm curious about another point he makes. Farotimi laments what he sees as the silence of a generation. He points to a decline in critical thinking and a lack of voices willing to speak truth to power.
It's a powerful observation. He talks about how the press, which was once so vibrant, has become increasingly compromised. He sees this trend in art and music, which have shifted away from social commentary towards materialism. Even religious leaders, he argues, are often more concerned with profit than truth.
Is he saying that these institutions, which should be holding a mirror to society, have become part of the problem?
He is suggesting that they've become complicit in the status quo, either out of fear or self-interest, and this lack of critical voices creates a vacuum where misinformation and manipulation can thrive. He brings up a very interesting anecdote about Wole Soyinka to illustrate this point.
Yes, this really made me think. So Soyinka have been notably quiet in recent years, which has led to a lot of criticism. But Farotimi offers an alternative perspective.
Instead of seeing Soyinka's silence as a betrayal, he suggests it might be a sign that it's time for a new generation to find its own voice. He's not defending Soyinka, but he's challenging us to consider if the responsibility has shifted.
It's a lot to consider. It's easy to criticize those who came before us, but are we truly doing enough to be part of the solution? Are we speaking up against injustice, demanding accountability, and working to create the kind of Nigeria we want to see?
These are questions that Farotimi doesn't answer for us. He leaves us to grapple with them, to confront our own complacency, and consider what role we're willing to play in shaping the future of Nigeria.
It's a heavy responsibility, but one that we can't afford to ignore.
And that's the power of Farotimi's work. It doesn't offer easy answers. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths and ask ourselves some difficult questions. We'll continue unpacking these ideas in the next part of our discussion.
So stay tuned and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to IAMC Radio and Podcast.
We're continuing our exploration of Dele Farotimi's Do Not Die in Their War. And last time we were discussing that sense of hopelessness that kind of permeates Nigerian society and how it really enables corruption and impunity to thrive.
Yeah, and Farotimi goes even further. He argues that this culture of silence and acceptance has actually been weaponized.
Oh.
He uses the term weaponization of poverty and ignorance.
That sounds pretty intense. Could you unpack that for us? What exactly does he mean?
It's a really insightful concept. Farotimi points out that oppressive systems, like feudal systems, rely on keeping people ignorant and impoverished.
Because if people are struggling just to survive, they're less likely to question those in power or demand better.
Exactly. He contrasts this with his own experience growing up in Nigeria. He talks about attending good public schools where he received a quality education, even mentioning having teachers from other countries.
It sounds like a completely different world from what we see today.
That's his point. He argues that Nigeria has regressed in terms of education and opportunity. Instead of investing in its people, he believes the system is actively working to keep them down.
So it's not just a lack of investment. It's a deliberate strategy to maintain control.
Precisely. And this weaponization of ignorance extends beyond just education. Farotimi discusses the role of the press and how it's become increasingly compromised, often serving the interests of those in power rather than the public. He even argues that social media, which has the potential to empower people, is often used to spread misinformation and propaganda.
But isn't there more access to information now than ever before? How does that fit into Farotimi's argument?
It's true that the internet has opened up access to information, but it's also created a flood of information, making it difficult to discern truth from falsehood.
Right.
This can actually be more dangerous than limited access because people might believe they're informed when they're actually being manipulated.
So it's this multi-pronged attack on people's ability to think critically and form their own opinions, coupled with the burden of poverty.
Yes, and when you combine that with the crushing weight of poverty, it creates a population that's vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. This is a bleak picture, but one we need to confront if we're serious about creating a better Nigeria.
It's a lot to process, but I appreciate you laying it out so clearly. Where do we go from here? What does Farotimi suggest we do?
He argues that breaking the cycle requires addressing the root causes. We need to invest in education, empower people with knowledge, and create opportunities for economic advancement. And he introduces this intriguing idea of dialogues of ventriloquists.
Okay, that sounds a little creepy. What's that all about?
It's a clever analogy. Think about a ventriloquist and their dummy. The dummy is speaking, but it's a ventriloquist who's truly in control.
So who are the ventriloquists and who are the dummies in this scenario?
Farotimi argues that in Nigeria, there are powerful forces, those principalities and powers, as he calls them, who use others to speak for them. They manipulate those who are vulnerable, often by exploiting their poverty or ignorance.
It's like they're using people as mouthpieces to advance their own agendas. Are there any examples of this in the book?
He gives several. He talks about the quit notice issued to the Igbo living in the north and how certain politicians immediately jumped on that bandwagon, condemning the messengers while ignoring the underlying issues.
It's like they're trying to appear as saviors while actually benefiting from the very system that's causing the problem.
Exactly. And what's even more dangerous is that the public often falls for it. People are so desperate for solutions that they're willing to believe anyone who appears to be on their side.
It's as if we're all at this giant ventriloquist show, and we can't tell who's really pulling the strings. So what's the antidote? How do we see through these dialogues of ventriloquists?
Farotimi is urging us to awaken from our slumber, to stop being passive observers. He's calling on the middle class in particular to stop being complicit in this charade and start demanding real accountability.
He's saying we need to start thinking for ourselves and challenging those in power, even when they appear to be on our side.
Yes, we need to look beyond the rhetoric and examine the actions, the motives, and the track records of those who claim to represent us. And he then dives into the different types of leadership we see in Nigeria, talking about thinking thieves versus unthinking thieves.
I'm intrigued. What's the distinction?
This is where Farotimi explores the nuances of leadership styles that have emerged in Nigeria. He argues that in some parts of the country, particularly in the West, there's a tradition of the philosopher king.
Like Awalo, for example. Leaders who are viewed as intellectuals and derive their legitimacy from the relevance of their policies.
Exactly. However, Farotimi argues that even this model has been corrupted. He points to the emergence of what he calls thinking thieves, who cloak their corruption in progressive rhetoric. They talk a good game about social justice and equality, but in reality, they're just as self-serving as the unthinking thieves.
So it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. They use their intelligence and charisma to deceive the public and enrich themselves at the expense of the people they claim to represent.
That's the danger. And he argues that this type of corruption is actually more insidious than the blatant corruption of the unthinking thieves. It creates disillusionment and cynicism, making people question the very idea of good governance.
Because if even the so-called progressives are corrupt, who can you trust?
That's the real threat. Farotimi then delves into how this dynamic has played out in the formation of various political parties and the alliances that have been formed over the years. He highlights how the pursuit of power often trumps any genuine desire for change, and how the same people who benefit from the system are constantly entrusted with fixing it.
The frustrating cycle. Is he saying there's no hope? Are we doomed to repeat these patterns?
Not necessarily, but he's urging us to be more discerning in our choices and to demand better from those who aspire to lead us. He believes that we need to break free from this pattern of outsourcing our hopes to those who have repeatedly proven themselves unworthy of our trust.
So we need to stop looking for saviors and start holding those in power accountable. But how do we do that in a system that seems designed to silence dissent?
That's a challenge. But Farotimi believes it starts with recognizing and dismantling the systems of oppression that keep us divided and disempowered. One of those systems, he argues, is the myth of the North.
Okay, I'm curious about this. What does he mean by the myth of the North?
He argues that the idea of a monolithic North with a unified agenda is a fallacy.
He's acknowledging the diversity within the North and suggesting that the interests of various groups often clash.
Precisely. He points out that there's incredible diversity within the North and that the interests of various groups often conflict. He specifically mentions the plight of minority groups in the North who have been marginalized and oppressed by those in power. He asks, are the Kataf of southern Kaduna part of this motley crew that speak in the name of northern Nigeria? What about the Biram and Angus of Plateau, the Tiv, the Egbira, the Jukun, the Tafawa Balewa of Bauchi? Are they part of that North?
That's a powerful question. He's exposing the hypocrisy of those who claim to speak for the entire North, while ignoring the voices of those who don't fit into their narrow definition.
Yes, and he goes on to argue that this myth of a unified North has actually been used to divide the country and prevent meaningful progress. It's a strategy that benefits those in power by allowing them to pit different groups against each other while maintaining their own dominance.
So it's a distraction from the real issues of poverty, inequality, and corruption that affect all Nigerians regardless of where they come from.
Exactly. And he challenges both Southerners and Northerners to reject this divisive rhetoric and start building bridges based on shared values and a common vision for a better future.
Farotimi seems to be saying that we need to move beyond these manufactured divisions and focus on the systemic issues that are holding us back. But where do we go from here? What's the next step?
That's a question we'll explore in the final part of our conversation. We'll delve into Farotimi's vision for a new Nigeria and his call for individual action. He offers a roadmap for change, but it requires us to be active participants, not passive observers.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to IAMC Radio and Podcast.
We're concluding our exploration of Dele Farotimi's Do Not Die in Their War.
And, we've covered some really heavy topics so far. It feels like we've uncovered a lot of these, deeply ingrained problems.
Yes, we've explored the weaponization of poverty and ignorance. We talked about those unsettling dialogues of ventriloquists. And we delved into the distinction between those thinking thieves and unthinking thieves.
Right. It's a lot to process. But amidst all of these challenges, Farotimi does offer a glimmer of hope. He genuinely believes that Nigeria is worth saving.
Absolutely. And he's not just highlighting the problems, he's offering a path forward. He believes in Nigeria's potential.
So what does he propose we do? How do we dismantle this entrenched system of corruption and impunity?
Well, Farotimi argues that change starts with the individual. He rejects the idea of waiting for a savior or a revolution. He really emphasizes personal responsibility.
So he's suggesting we each have a part to play.
Exactly. He believes that each of us has a responsibility to challenge the status quo. We need to reclaim our voices, speak truth to power, and hold those in authority accountable.
This sounds like a call to action, but it also feels, a bit overwhelming. Where do we even begin?
Well, Farotimi emphasizes that it's not just about grand gestures. It's about the small, everyday acts of resistance. Refusing to participate in corrupt practices, demanding transparency from our leaders, supporting those who are working to create a better Nigeria.
So it's about shifting our mindset and making conscious choices in our daily lives.
Yes, and he uses this really powerful phrase, the duty of leadership. And he argues that it's not confined to those in elected office. It's a responsibility that falls on all of us.
So he's kind of broadening the definition of leadership, moving it beyond those formal positions of power.
Precisely. He challenges us to consider how we're exercising that leadership in our own lives. Are we setting a good example? Are we speaking up against injustice? Are we using our skills and resources to make a positive impact?
It's a call to step up, to be active participants in shaping our nation's future, not passive bystanders.
And that brings us to the end of our exploration of Dele Farotimi's Do Not Die in Their War.
It's been a challenging but ultimately inspiring journey. We've confronted some uncomfortable truths, but I think we've also discovered a sense of agency.
Farotimi reminds us that the future of Nigeria is not predetermined. It's in our hands to shape it.
Yeah, he leaves us with this powerful message. Nigeria is at a crossroads, and the choices that we make today will determine its course.
So let's choose wisely. Let's choose to stand on the side of truth and justice. Let's choose to build a Nigeria where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Until next time, thank you for listening to Understanding Our History.